May 2009, the highest mountain on the planet. The German climber Frank Ziebart is making his way to the summit of Everest along the harsh northern side, and he is doing it without a single breath of bottled oxygen. This is his triumph, the great proof of his entire life. But he will never come back down from that summit. Somewhere near the third step, at around 8,700 meters, he could still have been saved. He will refuse. Why does a strong, experienced man choose loyalty to his principle when his very life is at stake? Frank Ziebart leaves behind surprisingly few traces. Almost everything that is reliably known about him fits into a few lines. A German climber who, by the end of the 2000s, is living in Calgary, Canada, a city at the gateway to the Rocky Mountains. He moves to Canada from Germany about 2 years before his death. Where exactly he was born, what kind of family he grew up in what year he came into the world. About all this, the open sources are silent. We know only that he finishes secondary school with his final exams back home, and that he comes to the great mountains through the Alps, so close and familiar to any European. At the time of his last ascent, he is just 29. By now the Alps are behind him. He is drawn higher, into the Himalayas, where the peaks rise beyond 8,000 meters, and there is half as much air as at the sea. It is an entirely different world, where even an ordinary step turns into a struggle. Here, among the highest mountains on Earth, Frank makes the choice that will define everything that follows. He decides to climb without bottled oxygen. To understand how serious this is, it is enough to picture the modern Everest. Today, a spot on its summit can, in effect, be bought. For a great deal of money, a person will have an expedition assembled, fixed ropes hung, gear carried, oxygen handed out, and will be guided to the top almost by the hand. Along this prepared road, dozens of clients go up in a single season, and in good weather lines form on the slopes. The highest mountain in the world becomes an expensive service. Frank rejects such a path. To him, it is akin to deceiving himself. His own idea is simple and severe. The ascent must be honest. No bottles that artificially lower the mountain by a couple of thousand meters. No other people's hands doing the hardest work for you. Only the man and the mountain, one-on-one. There is a beauty in this simplicity, and there is a price as well. Oxygen at high altitude is almost a lifeline. It pushes back the threshold beyond which the body begins to fail. Without it, Frank knowingly walks along the very edge of human limits. And it is this same uncompromising spirit that gives him the finest climbs of his life. He tests his principle where it costs the most, on the 8,000ers of the Himalayas and Tibet. Here you cannot cheat. Either you go up on your own breath, or you do not go up at all. At 8,000 meters, that difference stops being philosophy and becomes pure physiology. The first such peak is Cho Oyu, the 8th highest mountain on the planet, 8,188 meters. This happens in 2005. For many, Cho Oyu is the first serious 8,000er, and for Frank too, this mountain becomes a starting point. It is usually considered the most accessible of the giants, but that word is deceptive. There is no such thing as an accessible 8,000er without oxygen. Frank crosses this threshold and confirms it. His principle works. After Cho Oyu comes Shishapangma, 8,027 meters, the only 8,000er that lies entirely within Tibet. The exact dates of this ascent, its route, and his companions have not survived in the sources, as is the case with almost everything from the early alpine period of his life. Frank, in general, leaves astonishingly few records of himself. It is as if he goes to the mountains for the sake of the climb itself, not for glory. What remains is the bare fact, another of the highest mountains crossed without a bottle. With each such peak, his experience grows. So does the risk. A climb without oxygen is like a bet placed again and again. The more often you go up to that altitude without a safety net, the thinner your margin becomes, and the less right to error you have left. Frank understands this, and still he goes on. The third major peak on his list becomes Lhotse, 8,516 meters. It is the 4th highest mountain in the world, and it stands right beside Everest. Their summits are separated only by a high pass. From Lhotse, a photograph of Frank on the summit survives, one of the few images by which he can be recognized in the mountains at all. The route and the exact date of this ascent, as with Shishapangma, remain unknown. This is how his reputation takes shape. To the highest mountain in the world, Frank comes as an experienced high-altitude climber, three 8,000ers behind him, and each one taken without a single gulp of someone else's oxygen. Ahead lies Everest, a mountain on which his rule has never once been tested. Frank is by no means a lonely fanatic fleeing the world. Down below, in Calgary, a woman he loves is waiting for him, Christina Ziegler. They have been together for about 4 years. Between expeditions, he lives an ordinary, quiet life, but the mountains remain his main passion, and Christina accepts this. Everest, for the two of them, is a goal he has worked toward for years. Every departure of his into the mountains means a long separation and a wait for his return. For his next peak, he chooses precisely this one, the highest point on the planet, and right away, he makes 2 decisions, each of which makes the task harder. The first, he will climb Everest from the Tibetan northern side, harsher and less developed than the popular southern route. The second, and the main one, he will once again refuse bottled oxygen. On this mountain, where almost everyone goes with bottles, he intends to climb on his own breath. To grasp what this means, you have to understand what happens to a person up there. Everything above 8,000 meters climbers call the death zone. That is an exact description, not a pretty metaphor. There is so little air here that the body stops recovering and gradually loses strength. The organism runs itself into the ground. Even a strong, superbly prepared person grows weaker here before your eyes. An oxygen bottle slows this exhaustion. Without it, the time spent at altitude becomes far more dangerous. How rare such a choice is, a single figure makes clear. Of all those who have successfully reached the summit of Everest, only about 2% did so without supplemental oxygen. The other 98 chose the bottle. Frank knowingly takes his place in this tiny minority. For him, such an ascent is the highest and most honest form of everything he believes in. If he can take Everest on his own breath alone, his principle will be proven all the way, on the highest mountain in the world. It will be the summit of his own path. But the very honesty for which he refuses help turns his plan into one of the most dangerous ways to reach the top. And still, he chooses precisely this version of his dream. In the spring of 2009, Frank finds himself where he has wanted to be for so long, at the foot of the northeast ridge of Everest, on the cold Tibetan side of the mountain. From here, from the north, a long chain of high camps leads to the summit, and the climb takes weeks. First, the body must grow used to the thin air, camp by camp, ever higher, and only then prepare for the decisive push. He goes as part of a small international team, put together by the Kathmandu agency Monte Rosa. It is not a huge commercial expedition with dozens of clients, but a modest group of a few people. The team shares a common route and the same camps, but high up everyone is largely responsible for himself. Among them are the Polish climber Anna Baranska and the Canadian Alexandra Perret. In those May days, they will be the closest of all to Frank, and, without knowing it, will become his last companions. But even within this small team, Frank stands apart. Almost everyone is planning to go for the summit with oxygen. It is more reliable and safer. He remains the only one who intends to climb without a bottle. Across the whole 2009 season on Everest, people like him can be counted on one hand. In the end, only 2 will reach the summit itself without oxygen. All around, life is teeming with loud stories. Someone is laying out, up a sheer wall, an extremely difficult new route that will later be written about as the climb of the season. Someone at the age of 65 becomes the oldest of his countrymen to set foot on the summit. Against the backdrop of these noisy records, Frank's quiet bet is barely noticeable. He has no large support team, no sponsor banners, no headlines in the papers. There is only him, the mountain, and his rule. The chief enemy here is called the weather. High on the ridge, the winds rage constantly, and you can only head up in rare days of calm, in a short weather window. Dozens of people in base camp wait for weeks for a forecast that will let them make a dash for the summit. Everyone watches the sky and the bulletins. Patience here is worth no less than strength. To get the weather wrong at such an altitude is far too dangerous. In the second half of May, such a window finally opens. The team sets off for the summit. The decisive push begins while it is still dark. To make it up and back down before nightfall, the climbers leave the upper camp in the dead of night. By the light of their headlamps, they crawl slowly upward along the steep rocky ridge, with an almost kilometer-deep abyss beneath their feet. The cold here is brutal, and the air is so thin that each breath brings only a small fraction of the oxygen needed. The main obstacle of this stretch awaits them at around 8,600 meters. This is the second step, a short but almost sheer rock wall standing directly across the path to the summit. At such an altitude, even a few meters of vertical drain the last of your strength. For many years, the second step was considered nearly the hardest place on the classic northern route. Today it is overcome by means of a fixed metal ladder, but even with it, this push remains a grueling test. It is here, at the second step, that the team's story splits in two. Alexandre Paré feels his strength running out. He understands a simple and terrible thing. If he goes on, he may not have enough left for the descent. And Paré makes what is perhaps the wisest decision of his life. He turns back. To turn around a few hundred meters from the summit for which years have been spent, is also a kind of courage, and a rare one at that. Frank decides differently. He will not retreat when the summit is already so close. He is left alone and continues the climb. And here his central choice begins to take effect. Without oxygen, every step comes harder and slower for him than for those breathing from a bottle. What for others is a difficult but steady climb turns for him into a fight for every movement. He saves every effort, a step, then several breaths, then a step again. From this moment on, Frank stays higher than all his companions and climbs more slowly than any of them. The distance between him and the rest of the team grows. He is still strong and sure of himself, and from the outside, it looks as if everything is under control. But he is going ever farther up, into the thinnest part of the atmosphere, and falling ever further behind in time from those around him. While Frank, slow and alone, is still crawling upward, his companions are already reaching the goal. On the 21st of May, at around 7:30 in the morning, Anna Baranska reaches the summit of Everest, the highest point on the planet, almost 8,850 meters above the sea, has been taken. Day is breaking. At such an altitude, the dawn comes earlier than in the valleys. Below them spreads the curve of the horizon, and the clouds remain far down below. From here you can see how vast the earth is. Frank appears here noticeably later, about an hour and a half after her. Those 90 minutes are the very price of his choice. Without oxygen, he moved more slowly than everyone, but at some point, the ridge ends, and there is nowhere left to go. Above is only sky. Frank stands on the summit of the highest mountain in the world, having reached it without a single breath of bottled oxygen. The thing he lived for has come to pass. Years of perseverance and all his earlier experience have converged here, at a single point, on the very top of the earth. This is his moment, and in it he is entirely alone. That same morning, even before Frank, a man named Apa Sherpa reaches this very summit. For him, this is already his 19th ascent of Everest, more than anyone in history. The whole world will learn of his record. The papers will write about him. He will be welcomed as a hero. Frank has none of this. Beside him on the summit, there is no film crew, no flags, no one waiting to capture his triumph. The greatest achievement of his life takes place in almost total silence. No one films him up there, and almost no one, apart from a handful of people on the route, even knows that he is here. This is Frank in a nutshell. Records, headlines, the admiration of others held no interest for him. What mattered was the bare fact that he could do it. His victory is honest and personal, exactly as he wanted it to be. For a few minutes, he becomes one of the rare few who have taken Everest on their own breath. For him, that is enough. He was seeking a mountain, not witnesses, and he has found it. But there is no lingering on the summit. The cold, the thin air, and the strength draining away with every minute drive you down. And the long descent begins, for Frank the hardest part of the whole climb. The body is already worn out from the ascent. There is still no oxygen, and the way down leads along those same sheer rocks, only now on tired legs and in a race against the fading day. On the descent, the paths of Frank and Anna Baranska part. At one point, he complains to her about the cold. Baranska, struggling herself, gives him her gloves, a simple gesture that, at such an altitude, can cost a great deal. In such frost, without gloves, hands can be lost very quickly. And yet, she is not seriously alarmed. Before her is a strong, experienced high-altitude climber. He carries himself with confidence and instills calm in his companions. No one nearby understands how exhausted he truly is. From the outside, it seems Frank is simply slower than the others, and nothing more. As he descends, he reaches the third step, a rocky ledge at around 8,700 meters, just below the summit. Here he is seen alive for the last time. This is very close to the summit. He manages to descend only a little before something goes wrong. What follows is a story we know only from the outside. According to the accounts, another climber passes by. He stops next to Frank and spends several hours beside him. He sees that the man is in a bad way, and he offers him the one thing that can save a life at this altitude: oxygen, and Frank refuses. The stranger does everything he can, but it is impossible to force a grown, experienced man to breathe from a bottle against his will. Why? No one knows for certain. Later, his beloved Christina will say that she does not understand the reason. Perhaps Frank was already too worn down to realize what he was doing, or perhaps he was still clinging to his principle and hoping to descend on his own breath, just as he had climbed. This account has reached us secondhand through other people's retellings, and no one has confirmed it in documents. So the loyalty to his principle that had carried him to the summit on the descent turns against him. Down below, in the high camp, they are waiting for him. But Frank does not come back. An hour passes, then another. Night falls, and still he is not there. At first, this is put down to his usual slowness without oxygen. But time goes on, and gradually it dawns on the team what no one wanted to admit. From such an altitude, in the dark, drained of strength, and without a bottle, he will not be coming down. He never emerges from the gloom, and the faint hope melts away with every hour. In this lies the cruel paradox of the great mountains. Up there, at the third step, everything is already decided. The mountain seems to know the outcome before the people down below grasp it. And the people are still waiting, still hoping, for a miracle that will not happen. At such altitudes between life and death, there sometimes lie only a few hours and a few dozen meters. But they can no longer be crossed. And then the weather turns away from the people as well. In the following days, a heavy snowfall comes down on the mountain. Visibility drops to almost nothing, and every extra hour up high drains strength. Now the whole team has to save itself, fighting its way down through snow and wind. Going back up for Frank is out of the question. The mountain seems to close the door behind him, cutting him off from everyone who might have helped. Once they have come down to safety, Frank's comrades do what they must. They release a brief statement of his death. By their account, he was killed by hypothermia and a lack of oxygen. Later, other versions will be heard. Some speak of severe altitude sickness that affected the mind, others of other forms of it. What truly happened, no one will ever establish for certain. At over 8,000 meters, there are no doctors and no instruments nearby. There remain only the guesses of those who were close by, and no official conclusion about Frank's death will ever appear. At first, he is reported on cautiously, as a possible fifth victim of the season. Soon the figure is confirmed. A quiet climb, which almost no one knew about, turns into a line of statistics. By the end of the spring of 2009, Everest claims 5 lives. One of them is Frank Ziebart. But behind that dry line stands an argument that flares up almost at once. Frank's death cuts to the quick of the entire climbing community and reignites an old theme about the no-oxygen style and about what the modern Everest has become at all. One man, by his death, again makes everyone wonder where the line runs between bravery and recklessness. The voices divide at once. Some condemn the very idea of going to such an altitude without oxygen. To them, it is an unjustified risk, almost a challenge to fate. A man deliberately strips himself of his safety net precisely where it matters most, and pays for it with his life. From their point of view, such a death could easily have been avoided. All he had to do was take a bottle. They see in what happened, above all, the senseless loss of a strong and young man. Others see it differently. They grant Frank the right to decide for himself how to go to the mountains and what to risk. One well-known climber says outright that he cannot condemn him for this choice. Frank wanted to walk his own path to the end, honestly and for real, and there is a dignity in that. For these people, he is not a reckless man who threw his life away, but someone who stayed true to himself. But nearly everyone, regardless of which side they take, agrees on one bitter lesson. There is a simple truth in mountaineering that beginners often forget. The summit is only half the way. The far more dangerous half is to come back down alive. Most tragedies happen precisely on the descent, when the goal has already been reached. strength is running out, and attention is dulled. The relief of a height taken sometimes deceives more than the height itself. Frank went up, but the way back down he did not complete, so his story becomes a rare example that both sides cite at once. For some, he is a warning of where excessive risk leads. For others, the image of a man who did not betray his principle even at the cost of his life. One and the same descent from the third step becomes both a stern lesson in safety and a story about loyalty to oneself. At an altitude of nearly 9,000 meters, none of these words change anything. There is no room there for arguments or for sides. There is only the cold, the wind, and a man who never came down. To bring him down from here is beyond anyone's power. Any such attempt would cost new lives, and Frank remains where the mountain caught him, at the third step, on the very path along which others go on climbing toward the summit year after year. His story might have ended there, one more name left on the slope, but a year after the tragedy it acquires a quiet, very personal continuation. And it is bound up with one person who had waited for him down below. In 2010, the Canadian climber Gabriel Philippi goes up along that same northern route. He comes here not only for the summit. Christina cannot reach this altitude herself, and she asks him for one thing, to do for Frank what she cannot do herself. Philippi manages to climb up to Frank, but carrying out Christina's request to the end does not work. The mountain holds tight and does not give back everything. Even simply to climb up here a year later, just to be near Frank, is in itself at the edge of the possible. There is one more reason he is here. Frank was supposed to have had two things with him, a camera and a rolled-up banner. On the summit of Everest, at the highest point of his life, he intended to propose to Christina. The photograph and those few words on the cloth were to become their shared memory of the happiest day. The mountain he loved so much was meant to give them their brightest memory. It gave them a tragedy. Philippi searches for them. He looks for the camera that might hold the last frames. He looks for that very banner with the proposal, the one for which Frank had pushed so hard to reach the top. But he finds neither. All that remains of a great plan and a great love is a pair of spare gloves. The proposal that was meant to be spoken on the roof of the world was never made. And down below, an entire life was left behind, one that now has to be lived without him. Christina was left, and the shared future that will never be. A father was left, having lost his son on the other side of the earth, on a slope he will never climb. For them, Everest is no longer a great mountain, but the place that took someone dear to them. The words of Frank's father are simple and terrible in their directness. He says that this mountain will forever remain his son's grave. It is impossible to bring Frank down from such a height, and he, the father, understands this. But in those same words there is no reproach, no attempt to blame anyone. Frank, he says, knew what risk he was taking. He knew and went anyway. And the family is not ashamed of his choice. On the contrary, those close to him say they are proud of his unbending will, his courage, and what he managed to achieve. In their grief there is no bitterness. There is pain and there is pride, and they walk side by side. For a while people write about Frank. His death is reported by the papers in Canada, where he lived, and in Germany, where he came from. But time passes, and the noise dies down. No major film about him will ever be made. His name will not become a loud one. The most detailed account of Frank will remain a book, written by that very climber who once came up to him on the ridge. For most people, though, he will remain a single line in the long list of those who never came back from Everest. And yet, this quiet, almost unnoticed story is worth telling. Frank Ziebart wanted to meet the highest mountain in the world honestly, on his own breath alone, and he did. For this he paid the highest price there is. Whatever may be said about his choice, he stayed true to himself down to his very last step. In the history of Everest, he remains a quiet but important reminder of how much loyalty to oneself can mean to a person, and of how costly that loyalty sometimes turns out to be.